My purpose in this piece is not to delve into each composer's personal style, but rather to explore what drives composers and find out what their first compositions were, how they came to composition, and what helps them to write.
Are we on?
I usually look like I've stepped out of somewhere around the 1890s.
Should I look at you or add in my voice later?
Are we from here up or are we down?
I can't think of anything to say.
It's all right. Just take your time.
One of the first memories I have is of listening to music. And I remember sitting in front of the speaker, maybe 2 or 3 inches, it seems, away from it, listening to The Rite of Spring, which drove my mother crazy, but she indulged me. That's the earliest musical memory that I have. And I didn't think about becoming a professional, going into music professionally until I heard Pierrot. Pierrot is shorthand for Pierrot Lunaire, a piece by Arnold Schoenberg that was written in 1912. And I listened to it and hated it and thought, why is this being written about as an important, great piece of music, and I don't like it? So I made it my business to really find out what was in the piece. And at that point, I didn't sit down with a score and start analyzing it. I just kind of, in a brute force way, just listened to it over and over again. And aspects of it started to come into focus. The Pierrot was the door, and that's what I saw as being like I said, the portal into composing. So that's when I started writing music. Luckily, I've been composing in a sort of unbroken stream now for over 10 years. And I've got to say that I think in part because I've been working consistently now for this length of time, that I don't even think about inspiration. I just think, get up and work. When I'm in the middle of a piece, like I am now, I'll get up, pour the rest of the coffee from the day before, sit down at the computer and start working. And the work itself is its own inspiration. I don't ever think of emotional states or anything particularly narrative. It's the material itself. Visual art, yes, I will sometimes use that as a springboard. I've done with a few pieces by my wife, Linda Plotkin, and I will use some of her work as a place to start a piece. Kinesis, which is a piece of Linda's, was the piece that I based the guitar quintet on. And even there, it's more or less not trying to specifically write a piece of music that sounds the way that looks. But the idea that here are shapes that she was working with that is two-dimensional surface, but there's a lot of depth. It's only black and white, but she managed to, with black, and I shouldn't say only black and white, it's black and white. And with that two-dimensional black and white medium of monotype, she was able to create a sense of depth and also motion. And I thought, well, let me see what I can do with the idea of these shapes that twist and move out, and what would that sound like?
Usually I compose for a purpose. In other words, I'll need something. It's what Paul Hindemith used to call Gebrauchtmusik, which is music for a purpose, or music to be used. Most of my oeuvre so far has been for the synagogue. because that's what I do.
It helps to be commissioned. I mean, honestly, if somebody comes to you and say, I have these 4 ghost stories, and pick one and turn it into an opera, that's a lot of help. And if someone just says, do what you want, I don't know what to do.
Knowing the piece is going to be performed is plenty of inspiration. Duke Ellington once said, I don't need inspiration, I need deadlines.
Somebody asked Brahms once, oh, Brahms, you write such beautiful melodies. And he said, how do you do it? He says, my publisher asked me to.
When my parents got divorced and I went through all that emotional stuff, I really came to music in a big way. That summer I wrote a piece called Mystic Variations, lots of tritones. But I went on and became a piano major, graduated, did all of that. After graduation, I began composing more. And it was very freeing. I mean, I had the great background and foundation. I went to Manus and got that great theory. So I just began composing and performing some of my works, then getting other people to perform them. I think I began with songs because that was a way of really judging whether I'd hit the mark with the words, and then went on to instrumental pieces. Sometimes it's something that I really feel I need to express, like to get through a difficult experience or to express a wonder or beautiful something I want to remember, or an experience I want to integrate. Like I had a residency in Taos and coming back and being on the streets of New York City and trying to keep that feeling of the wide open, off the grid. And so this piece, The Beauty Way, is somewhat a combination, combining those different feelings for me. And lately I've been experimenting more with process pieces, using the mind first and figuring out the structures or whatever and going from there. Listening. Not necessarily to music, but to life. Counter rhythms on the street, watching the lapping waves, the beautiful sunset, if that's not too passé. I got on the top 100 list of this blogger who's written for The Times, Ted Zhao, I think this is his name, I'm number 37, but contemporary pastoral something, which I don't know, I think he made that category up, I've never heard of it. I have this city and country thing going on. I live in New York City, but I'm upstate quite a bit, and nature is very important to me, and it feeds me quite a bit. So, a lot of times I guess I'm going to come to that quiet place, and to bring people into that, I suppose.
I have a background in piano, and so my first pieces were little piano pieces. I actually don't like to write music without words. So my process is integrally involved with text and music and text. I mostly like to do these kinds of theater projects, operas, with voices and characters. Pieces with characters. I wrote the music and the words to that piece, to this Alice Riley piece, and so it's important to me. As part of my process, I go back between the words and the music and the music and the words. If I get stuck on one, I move to the other. And so it's this kind of ping pong process. I have done projects where I worked with other people as lyricists or librettists, so that just depends. I'm not at all well known in this, but I have a songwriting background as well, as a classical music background, and so part of songwriting is usually not a clean process where one person writes the music and one person writes the words. And so what you do is that I gradually got more and more comfortable with writing words through writing songs. And so I'm very comfortable writing words now, and gotten to the point where I think my words are interesting. So that's kind of where I am on that. It's really important to me in the process that I know the subject matter that they're interested in. I know the level of artists that they are going to supply. I know the length. I have some conception of the audience, because I do believe I'm writing with an audience in mind. Like, I don't know, I would write this piece, I suppose, differently if I knew it was being premiered in New York as opposed to Georgia. I don't know, that sort of thing.
I remember that once you were in the 4th grade, when you're in elementary school, the middle school teacher would come into the classrooms and demonstrate all of the instruments. It was like a big day that like everyone really looked forward to. It was probably one of the things that I remember like being the coolest thing about being in the 4th grade. In fact, when everyone was learning how to drive, they ended up like saving all their money from after-school jobs to buy a car. I actually ended up saving my money to eventually buy an instrument. So I was one of the last people to figure out how to drive or even own a vehicle. I stuck with oboe until I ended up getting a double reed scholarship when I went into college, which was great because that was a good way to start funding my higher education for a couple of years. I applied thinking I was going to be in the history program, actually. And then on the off chance, just sort of dropped my composition portfolio off at the music school, to which the director said, like, actually, you have some pretty good things here. Would you consider, like, switching your major and applying to our program? To which, I mean, that's a big decision and has probably influenced a lot of what I do. But yeah, I, from that point on, was officially a composer. I like collaborating with other arts. So other artists tend to inspire what I do or subjects that I take on. I have bags and bags of ideas of my own. Even if they come from my own idea bag, I'll definitely integrate other people into my performances as well. Like, this piece really needs to be accompanied with like movement here. Like, is there something you feel like you could choreograph for this moment? Everyone has their own sort of interests and areas of expertise.
I do most of my composing. I mean, I use the piano. I don't really play the piano, of course, but I will sit down and use the piano to try to figure out the chords and the melody and things like that, sort of work things out, and then put it into the computer and play it back to see what it sounds like. The computer is a great tool for someone like me who can't really sit down and play it as it should sound. Now, I can feel my way through it, but I can't play well enough to really sit right down and make it, especially if it's something more complicated.
It's practical if I can go right to finale, because sometimes it takes longer to put it in finale than it did to come up with it in the first place. You know what I mean?
The medium really does affect the message, so the pieces I end up writing on paper are vastly different than the pieces that I end up writing on the computer for whatever reason. I find that I create more rhythmic music when I end up using the computer versus more like performance art or conceptual ideas when I work on paper. I try to do more work off of the computer, especially when it comes to like large scale format, like sort of like incorporating ideas and coming up with fragments are good ways to like represent them. So like macro form I try to do on paper now. That's kind of the industry standard, is to have computer notated music. So I think that does affect the kind of music that I ultimately create.
I mean, I originally started writing purely at the piano because I didn't know how to notate what I was playing to paper. But even today, what I do is I write the main ideas and the flow, I guess, at the piano, and then I'll doodle it or get a framework, and then I go to the program and I input it into the program, and I kind of edit and tweak it, and then when I can't do that because it's too complicated, I go back to the piano, figure it out, and then put it on the program. But I do a lot of my composing on the subway. I bring my little notebook and I like work out counterpoint or voice leading.
I use Sibelius. The great advantage of Sibelius over paper and pencil is that it's really good for editing. So it just makes the process a lot faster. There are times when I will, especially if it's vocal music and I want to get a sense of a large sweep of the vocal line and some ideas of what the instruments will be doing along with it, then I'll write the text out on music paper, write out some melodic lines to go with the text. Try to set the text and sketch out the other instruments, and then go over to Sibelius and polish it up. But I say I miss the tactile quality of pencil on paper.
Yeah, so I took music theory in high school, and it changed my life. And then I took a creative writing class, and I was very afraid of writing. And so for the essay project, I wrote a song cycle. And that was like I was more comfortable writing a musical essay than words essay. When I was in college, I became the go-to person to write music for plays. So I started having, this relationship with theater. And my senior year, there was a guest director who directed a play of Brecht, The Good Person of Sichuan. And I wrote the music for that production. And when I was out in California, he contacted me and said, there's a small theater in Minneapolis that's looking for a composer for a project. Send them your music. So I did that. They hired me. I became a composer in residence for a small theater company in Minneapolis at 22. It was just a lucky situation. And then I lived in Minneapolis for 6 years and wrote a lot of music for plays, and also, so I had sort of one foot in theater and then another foot in classical, and I had some pieces performed by the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and some small ensembles. I do everything. I write film scores, music for plays was kind of my bread and butter for a really long time. I've gone now, it sort of led me toward music theater in the largest sense of the word. So I've written several musicals and several operas, and both of those forms kind of like sit on a line that's very related to each other. So my musical theater, some of it people respond to as like, oh, that's kind of operatic, and my operas, people have said, oh, that's very musical theater. But I also love writing for instruments and working with people who play them, like talking to the musician who plays the instrument and finding the really personal things about that instrument and how to communicate that. And I just think that it's fascinating and interesting and keeps you out of isolation, which as a composer, it's very easy to become isolated because you do have to do so much of the work by yourself. And so anytime you can reach out and have a relationship with a musician or a performer or a director, just makes the work better and more interesting.
When I first heard that music for Looney Tunes, like when Elmer Fudd was singing Kill the Rabbit, and when Tom and Jerry were like playing the piano, and just the music, I think they had a lot of classical music back in the day in Looney Tunes. Then I would ask my parents, what kind of music is that? They're like, that's classical music. And then my parents were not musical people at all. So they had no recordings of classical music, and I really wanted to hear more classical music. And then my mom would take me to Sam Goody, which I don't think they even have anymore. It was like a CD store. Or a tape, no, it was tapes back in those days. And then we went to the tape store, and I got all these classical tapes. I just chose them, and then I listened to it, and I just fell in love with all that music. I was like 5 or 6. I just randomly selected the ones with the best pictures, and it was like Bach's Piano Concerto No. 1, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I still remember these. And then Pachelbel's Canon, which was kind of cheesy, and I thought that was the cheesiest one too. I was like, what is this? And then from there, I begged my mom for piano lessons, and I had my first piano lesson when I was like 6, but it was like at the school, and the guy like was an alcoholic or something. And then when I was 9 or 8, one of my friends took piano, and he said his teacher's very nice, and I got the teacher's number from him, and I gave it to my mom, and then I started music lessons ever since. Basically, as soon as I was able to play music, whatever I was able to play, I wanted to, that's how I started writing. I remember being 11, and I was like learning Fur Elise, and I was trying to change it. I was like, oh, I want to change this and do stuff with it. And that was like my first attempt at composing. I mean, for me, I write regardless. Because I think being a composer is no different than being a performer. You have to practice. And how do you practice? By writing. And I'm right in between commissions because I just finished one. And I started working on an art song just to have something to work on while I'm waiting for the next project. I'm very cranky if I'm not composing. I would say that The Voice found me rather than me thinking, oh, I want to write for The Voice. Right out of college, I got into the American Opera Project's Composer in the Voice program. And it was like my first experience writing for The Voice. That's when I heard all the different types of voices, and I learned to write for each type of voice. And I don't know, there's something so visceral, I know that word's used a lot, about The Voice. And what I love the most is that I have one song that gets performed a lot. And every time I hear that song performed by a different singer, they all do something different. It's the same exact music, but it sounds so different and beautiful with different singers. If it's an opera, right? So I like giving myself little chunks to work on. So if I'm working on a scene or a moment in an opera, I'm in that moment. I'm trying to envision what it's going to look like on stage. I'm trying to see what the audience is going to be thinking, and I'm trying to represent what that character is going through. So that's what I would focus on. What is this character going through? How do I make that sound genuine? What am I getting from myself? It's like acting. It's like, what am I getting from inside myself that I can relate to this character? A lot of my music is very emotionally driven. I'm trying to find how I can relate my life to whatever I'm trying to create. And if I can't write, I don't. I'll get up, I'll watch like People's Court or something. I really consider myself a romantic, purely. And that's the music I fell in love with, like late Beethoven, all that beautiful stuff. So when I was writing, I wanted to write something like that. That's how I felt, that's how I feel. I feel that very romantic, grand gestures. Well, my favorite word is dramatic and romantic. I don't think that's used that often.
Now, what is your favorite composition to date of yours?
Oh,
Do you have
gosh.
anything?
The next one.
The shadow-like generations. It's about the Oedipal myth, and that's one of my favorite songs. But I love them all. I love my children.
I guess if I had to pick a piece, I guess I would say Kinesis. The combination of elements, how the overall structure works. It's a fairly long piece, and yet I think it works in terms of the length. The rhythmic writing, the harmonic writing, I think the writing for the guitar is pretty good. So.
It's so corny, but whatever I'm working on in that moment is my favorite composition. Whatever I write is, expressing what I'm going through at that time, and it just incorporates my life. Basically, if I listen to all my old songs, I have like 40 art songs, and each song or thing I wrote was like commissioned or part of a concert at certain times in my life. So I would have to say my favorite piece is my song cycle, A Live Oak Growing, which was actually my first fully commissioned piece. And I remember I was getting over a very bad breakup at the time, and I just needed this piece to get over it. And it was like perfect timing, like, oh, I need you to write this big, long cycle about falling in and out of love. And whenever I listen to that, I'm brought right back to that moment in my life. So I think that's probably my favorite piece.
Of my own? Well, it's kind of the thing that's like on the front burner for me right now is an opera that I'm working on. I'm in Act 4 of 5 of the orchestration of it. And it's an opera called Ada, and it's about Ada Lovelace. She had a very short, dramatic, intense life. Yeah, it's my passionate thing that I'm doing.
Every composer usually loves their most recent composition. I guess if I had to pick one, it might be the Midsummer Night's Dream that you're referring to, because I think it's fun, and it achieves some things that are important to me, like having a blend of high styles and lower styles, kind of more vernacular styles, popular styles, and classical styles. And so I always look for opportunities to do that. And this particular piece has that, even in the very beginning, where it starts with kind of a Broadway tune and it moves into something that's more operatic.
I would say probably that our first influence was singing as a family. I grew up in a large family where everyone liked to sing, so on long car trips we would all sing together, often in harmony, along with my brothers and sisters and our cousins. We'd all harmonize and sing long, multiple versed songs that sometimes we made up. The first composition that was actually performed was something I wrote in high school also for an English project where you had to combine two art forms. So I wrote this really stupid poem that began, I still remember, began with the lines, "The essence of life is the whirling dervish of time." It was for two reciters and musicians, singers, actually it was for two voices who also played music. So while one person, they would sometimes play together, sometimes one person would be playing and the other one would be singing, and so forth. And so it was me and my friend Ned Kaufman. He played the recorder and I was playing the tuba. And we performed it for a music class, for an English class, and they were all pretty mystified by the whole thing. Actually, the concept was quite amazing when you think of it. I mean, two people, one who plays, one who sings, and they're both wind instruments, so you can't sing and play at the same time. It was sort of the beginning of my kind of career as a composer, because I liked doing it. I went to college, and as a music major, an opera major, a very useful degree. I basically performed in opera for the next 10 years, and finally found my way into the cantorate, which seemed to be a very good fit for me, because I'd always been a pretty spiritual person. It was really then that I started composing in earnest. I had been composing, my whole life writing little things, but I really started composing in earnest when I became a cantor, mostly because I couldn't find any music that matched my voice well. So I would write for my own voice most of the time. Usually I start with a text and compose the text, sort of like an opera composer would be. You have words. It's not like just pulling music out of thin air. So I try to write music that will express the text. And I have on my computer, for one piece that I wanted to write, for instance, I was writing a new piece for Rosh Hashanah service, and I wrote about 10 different versions of it, 10 completely different tunes, basically, until I found one that really seemed to click. Now, I think that once you start with an idea, and you work that idea out to a certain point, and sometimes it's sort of like being a writer. You'll work it out to a certain point, and you might say, well, it's not really working. I got to a certain point with it, but I couldn't take it any further. So that's it. But I do usually, find something finally at the end that I feel really can be developed and can come to fruition. Well, in some ways, a lot of the music I write for the synagogue is sort of in a pop vein, not poppy, but I'll try to pick a particular style of modern music and write it to it. When I'm composing for the synagogue, I try not to be too modernistic, because I think it interferes with people's ability to connect with the text. Some of the pieces that I've composed for other things that aren't strictly in the synagogue have been more challenging, shall we say. But for the most part, I try to write in a language that people can readily understand, that the ear can easily understand, so they're not confused by what they're hearing. I would compare myself poorly to the to the great liturgical composers of the past. But you take someone like Solomon Sulzer, who was really the first to take sort of, contemporary composition techniques. Well, unless you want to go back to Salomone Rossi, his stuff was never used in the synagogue until pretty recently, actually. Sulzer, of course, was a giant because he took the Nusach and the themes of sort of Eastern European Jewish music and created classical type compositions and sort of brought Jewish music single-handedly almost into the 19th century and made it sort of respectable. Many of the sorts that I've written have not really been designed for people to sing along with, but rather to be listened to. Sometimes even the ones that I write not to be sung along with end up being sung along with because I do them enough so that people learn them and then they sing along with it.
I came to it because my parents gave me piano lessons as a child. And by the time I was 8 years old, I was accompanying my father, who was a singer. So after high school, I went to Juilliard on an oboe scholarship. And then I switched to voice, so I had a double major. And so far, no composing. It was interesting because in my theory class, I had to write a piece. I had to write an Elizabethan song, and I wrote this song for the class, not because I was thinking of being a composer. And the teacher gave it back to me and said to me, "This is very good," like that, But it didn't go any further than that. He didn't say, you should write more. He didn't encourage me to be a composer. He was too interested in himself being a composer, I think. I needed to earn some money, and so I went to the placement bureau at Juilliard, and I asked to accompany voice teachers. But there were no openings for voice accompanists. They were all taken up. But they had just started the dance department in Juilliard, and she said I could accompany the dancers. So I did that. I became a ballet accompanist. For the modern dancers, I was improvising. I just took the job and I thought, well, I don't know what I'm doing. I'll just put my hands on the keys and start playing and see if it works. Well, it worked. One day I was up at the home of my friend Eric Blau. Eric Blau is a writer. He's the person who wrote Jacques Brel is alive and well and living in Paris. So Eric said to me, "Joyce, you're a composer," because I played improvisational piano. I said, "No, I'm not a composer. I just, whatever happens, happens, but I'm not a composer." He said, "You're a composer. I want you to write a song to this lyric." So he wrote this lyric. I was riding in the subway with this lyric, and I said to myself, well, I just don't want to write any old melody. What can I do? So I decided to write it in fourths, and it goes, da, 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 those are fourths. Da. It's called I Made This World, Johnny. I made this world, Johnny. That's how I started the song. I only had the fourths at the very beginning, and then of course I went on to write the melody. Well, it's a very good lyric. So I wrote the song and I played it for people, and people were very moved by the song. And I realized that I was a songwriter. No, I don't consider myself to be of a certain genre. Critics have referred to me as a neo-romantic. The neo gives me some legitimacy because I put dissonances into my music. Rhythm is very important element for me as a composer, as a writer. If you go to a concert and sometimes the composer will get up and say how they wrote it and what they wrote, and I wrote this chord and that chord, and I think, oh, go away. I want to hear the music. But you want no inspiration? Well, I'm not a lyricist, but sometimes I write lyrics. And my husband and I, he used to work at night, and well, we would meet each other at bars. Well, he went to Cornwall and spent about 3 months there, so I couldn't have drinks with him. So I went and met my friends at bars. And one day I met this friend at a bar and had a very good time. And we left the bar and we were walking on Madison Avenue to 57th Street, and I'm standing in the corner waiting for the light, and said to myself, I had a very nice time with her. It was really nice, but I miss my drinking buddy. And I said, drinking buddy. I said, that sounds like a lyric to a song, a title to a song. So I went home and wrote a song called Drinking Buddy. And people love it. But it's a pop song. But I wrote this whole lyric, and it really worked. I was always a feminist, but I didn't know it in a way, because we were hidden, And one day a friend of mine called up and said, Joyce, there's a feminist movement. Well, on August 26, 1970, we marched the Women's Strike for Equality down Fifth Avenue. And I got on that march, and people were carrying placards. And one of the placards said, Liberté, égalité, sororité. After the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And I said, wow, that's incredible. And I was so excited. I came home and I said, my God, I've got to write a song about this. I need somebody to write me a lyric. Who am I going to get? This is the middle of the night already, My husband was working at night, and we lived in this one room, so thank God he was working at night. So what I did was I said, damn it, I'm going to write the lyric. So I wrote the lyric to this song, Sororité, Sisterhood. And I got it played, this was August. I got it sent to somebody who had was running a feminist program on WBAI. And she played the song. I recorded it on tape, I sang it. And she played it on WBAI. And Jerry Silverman heard it. Jerry Silverman is a guitarist who published a book called The Liberated Women's Songbook, and put my song in it. So that was my first published song, and I wrote the lyric too, and I'm not a lyricist. And opposite on the facing page to my music is the marching women from the march, and I think that's a coincidence that I didn't tell them that it was the march that made me write the thing, But that was one of the biggest inspirations of my life.
Who is your favorite composer?
Haydn.
Why?
He's someone who always manages to figure out the best way to use the ideas that are there. And sometimes fairly unpromising ideas turn into really interesting pieces. There are often these really interesting twists in Haydn pieces that seem unexpected. Then you go back and look at the beginning of the piece, and it's right there in the first half of the first theme. There's this little thing that seems to be just a kind of little throwaway embellishment, and yet that turns into the whole development section of the piece. And I look at that and I think, wow, it's pretty amazing. There are always these wonderful setups for the other things that happen. Also, he had a great sense of humor. It always comes through in the music. And just this incredible richness of invention. You can write 107 symphonies. Catalog goes up to 104, but there are 107. They're not all equally great, but the dozen greatest symphonies are as good as any symphony that's been written since. Yeah, it's amazing. Unlike Mozart, you see him working. Mozart's great, but there's always a sense with Mozart that it's almost too easy. It just happens. Haydn, worked at it. I don't know that there's any particular virtue in that. It doesn't sound like he was working at it, but there's just a sense that he needed to give it a little more thought than Mozart did, and somehow, I don't know why, I find that appealing.
Bartók, love Bartók. And my first sort of memorable symphonic experience was my mother taking me to the Chicago Symphony when George Solti was conducting, and they played Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra. I just thought I had died and gone to heaven. It was so cool. It's very impressive. There's something about him. Again, he went around collecting folk music on some crazy heavy tape recorder, and it's in his language, and so there's something about people and people's voices that is at the center of his music.
Different times I've had a favorite composer, but I find it hard to choose one. I might be in the mood for one composer at a certain time. In the classics, I've been through a Schubert period, Beethoven, Bach, and in terms of the recent ones, recently I've been inspired by Lucas Ligeti, and he does a lot of process pieces, and he's a great improviser, and I just found his work very inspiring and make a lot of sense. But again, I like the full gamut, so I like to hear what other people are doing, and that's often an inspiration.
Is there any composer you can think of who had a really big influence on you when you were starting out as a composer? You were sort of would listen to those pieces and think, that's what I want to do.
Well, I think as a musician, Leonard Bernstein,
Yeah.
and, just his total musicianship and his way with words as well, and then the theater music and the serious stuff and the American feeling of it.
Beethoven. It's very cliche, but he's my favorite.
Well, you have to tell me why now.
For me, no one controls music like Beethoven does. He is in control of every single note, and he's doing it through hard work and effort, but it sounds so flawless and so effortless. And just the way he paces things, and when he has an arrival point, he stays there and he works that. A lot of composers, once they get there, they don't know what to do with it, and they kind of leave it and they try to go back to it. But Beethoven will get you there and keep you there and let you go when you're ready to go. And there's something about his music that he has the control of the old masters, but the emotions of the Romantic period, which I'm so in love with, which is I love the Romantic period, but they don't have that control that Beethoven does. So that's why I just love Beethoven, especially late Beethoven, but everyone will say that too.
I think Stravinsky has to be my all-time favorite composer. Through all of his different styles, he just nails it. He really does. Every new piece of it, because his output is actually quite vast. And some of the smaller pieces I still have yet to sort of know and become acquainted with, but one that I recently was introduced to is this incredibly smart string trio that came right before the Rite of Spring. It's such a little gem of a piece. It's incredibly well constructed, all very tight and neatly wound, and incredibly intelligent. You can't find, everything has its own internal logic and is incredibly well put together. So I think he has to be my favorite composer all around.
Well, it'd have to be Mozart, of course, I think. His use of harmonies and taking a simple melody and decorating it with harmonic and instrumental accompaniments is so, the way he seamlessly passes the melody from one instrument to the next You see the same thing in Rossini, less sort of developed and more fun. I like the fun part because a lot of my music has a sense of humor as well. Mozart is the top, I would say.
I hate to, it's like asking me who's my favorite composer.
Well, that's another question.
When I'm listening to Bach, Bach is my favorite composer. When I'm listening to Mozart, Mozart is my favorite composer. When I'm listening to Beethoven, he's my favorite composer. I get into that.
But is it like a choice of those three? Or?
You don't ask me the desert island joke, the question. You know that one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who I'd bring on the desert island with me.
I haven't written yet for solo piano, and for me that, in a way, that instrument is a bit daunting for me because it can do all these different things. It's got a huge range of pitches. It has a huge range of dynamics. The textural possibilities are tremendous. So in a way, that's almost an overwhelming instrument for me in a way that no other instrument is. I won't say it's an instrument I don't want to write for. I do want to write for it. As a solo instrument, it's just something that I think will create some initial problems for me when I finally do sit down to write for it. It's my white whale.
Or anything like that.
Yeah, I think above everything, I write for percussion the most. There's so many percussion instruments. So I love timbre, the idea of like different tone colors for instruments. And percussion is sort of like a limitless number of timbres. It's like if you can imagine the sound, you can create it either with one instrument or a combination of multiple instruments. If it were just me, I'd be like, oh, let's write a string quartet piece and also add percussion to it. Like, because I don't know, I love, especially mallet percussion. I think the vibraphone is just amazing. My first composition teacher was a percussionist and opened me up to this whole world of percussion repertoire.
The instrument that I've written the most for actually is the cello, simply because I have a friend who plays the cello, and I wrote a long service basically for cello and solo voice.
Favorite instrument? Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. But see, I'm an oboist, but I love to play. I love English horn. But I've written more for the clarinet, mainly because the clarinet has a bigger range. The oboe is limited, although I love the sound of the oboe. And in a sense, the piano is my favorite instrument. I love the sound of the piano when it's played by somebody who knows how to make beautiful sounds on a piano, which is not true of everybody. I enjoy writing for the piano with the voice. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a good answer.
I haven't written for sousaphone lately. Everyone knows that music is easy money.
My family was, oh, you're going to be a composer? Oh, you're going to be famous. I'm like, can you name me one living composer?
Well.
So, I don't care. They can call me whatever they like.
Where the music, I have no idea where I'm going.